Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madeline Jackson, and I'll be moderating today's panel. The title, Still We, Preserving LGBTQ Places for Connectedness with Our Communities. This is a live webinar brought to you by the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, the Montgomery County Planning Department, in celebration of Pride Month. Happy Pride Month to those of you who are celebrating, and hope that you are safe. We are continuing this effort with our Thrive Montgomery, which is a general plan for the 2050. And I just wanted to let you know that we want to make sure that this is a safe space, a brave place to have a good conversation. We are dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone, regardless of gender identity and expression, age, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, religion, or lack thereof, or technology choices. We do not tolerate harassment of Still We participants in any form during this discussion. I welcome you to use the chat box, but we encourage you to be respectful and to use the preferred pronouns in turn. If for any reason we see that there is a bit of language that we don't agree with necessarily that could be perceived as disrespectful, we will not post those languages. But feel free to email me, and I'll continue to post my email in the chat so that you're able to reach me even after this discussion. In a minute, we're going to have our planning director, Gwen Wright, kick this great event off, this great conversation that we're going to have. But before this time, we want to take a moment to pause and reflect on the grief that we're all experiencing in this moment. In this moment of peace, we ask that you set your intention on positive energy and projecting more mindfulness and empathy as members of the human race. Thank you. I also want to offer some helpful guidance when participating. Please mute yourself when talking, but feel free to use your camera. Use your headphones or your headsets to avoid feedback while speaking. Comments and questions, again, you're welcome to use the Q&A chat, but be mindful of the word choice and sensitive to those that are listening. As well as in the Q&A, feel free to post events for Pride Month because I will be announcing those towards the end of the conversation. If you don't have questions and you don't feel like speaking, you're more than welcome to email me and I will get back to you via email if you don't want to post it in the chat. So now I'm going to turn it over to Gwen to kick this thing off. Thank you. Gwen?
Yes, thank you so much, Molly, and thank you to everyone who's participating, whether you're here as a panelist, sharing your knowledge and experience with us, or if you are just listening into this webinar because you are interested in the topic and you're interested in connecting. We are in the midst of our general plan update. The name of our general plan is Thrive Montgomery 2050, and we take that title very seriously. We are looking at trying to create a blueprint for the future of the county where we can not just rest on our existing successes, but move forward in a positive way to go beyond just the good things that are currently happening to become outstanding and to really thrive as a community. We developed a framework of 3 important issues, which included economic health, environmental resiliency, and community equity. And coming out of that, we've developed a whole series of themes. And one of the themes, and I won't go over all of them, but one of the really important themes that has come up again and again is connectedness. That as a community, we want to be connected physically through trails and sidewalks and roads and transit, but also socially. We want to be a connected community, and that means everyone in our community connected together in honest dialogue and in all, rowing in the same direction to try to create a great place for all of us to live, to work, and to recreate. And so I'm very excited for the conversation today because it is about place. It's about the preservation of places that are important to all of us because they reflect important parts of our history. I'm going to share, I was the historic preservation supervisor for Montgomery County for nearly 20 years before I moved up and became ultimately the planning director. And preservation is not just about the places where George Washington slept, it is about all of us. It is about our culture. It is about reflecting who we are as a society. And it helps connect us. It is part of that Thrive Montgomery 2050 goal of connectedness. And so with all of that said, I am extremely excited about today's panel. I think that we're all going to learn a lot. And I will turn it back to Molly to go ahead and introduce the panel members. So thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. Our first panelist is Megan Baca, also known as Meg. Her original hometown is Buffalo, New York. She has an urban planning degree from the University of Buffalo, as well as the graduate degree in historic preservation from Clemson and the College of Charleston in North Carolina. Megan's official title is Director of Communications at Preservation Maryland, and she manages the outreach efforts. But she also has a lot of public history projects that she's mostly interested in. It's a small world because two of the panelists are also involved in some of her historic projects that she's working on currently and have provided context study. Megan is the former acting president of Preservation Action and an inaugural fellow of the Arcus Preservation Leadership. It's a training program. Megan's passion for bettering the preservation profession led to co-founding HisPres, a national job board, jobs and internship listserv. Meg spends a lot of time in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and her preferred pronouns are them, they, and theirs. Jeffrey Free Harris is originally from Hampton, VA. That's his hometown where he currently lives. He left Washington, D.C. in 2010, but has spent time working all over the country, specifically North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. Free went from an academic professor at the American University and made a transition into an independent consultant specializing in everything historic preservation. He's a nationally recognized speaker on topics of historic preservation and U.S. history. Formerly the director of diversity at the National Trust, Historic Preservation. He did that for 3 years. Studied history and American history at Clemson. Again, that's where Meg was. Small world. He got his master's degree in South Carolina and an undergrad at Hampden-Sydney College in Virginia. He's also very busy as a board member on the Virginia Historic Resources, the Rainbow Heritage Network, and his preferred pronouns are he, him, and his. Dr. Wells he actually participated in our last conversation, which happened on April 24th. Hopefully some of you are joining us again. Jeremy's original hometown is Fort Collins, Colorado, but he feels most at home here in the DMV. His official title, he got a promotion, y'all. Associate Professor at the Historic Preservation at the University of Maryland in College Park. Actually, my alumni, so go Terps. He's a strong advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives within the preservation enterprise, also known as the professional practice of historic preservation. Jeremy's research focuses on the psychology of heritage in place. He currently manages the heritagestudies.org website with the goal of making historic preservation more human-centered and bringing awareness to social justice issues in historic preservation. And last but definitely not least, who's actually our boss at the Maryland National Capital Park and one of our bosses at the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, Montgomery Planning, is Commissioner Partap Verna. He's our newest commissioner, originally from Prince George's County, which is where I actually live, in Adelphi. He grew up in neighborhoods of Adelphi and Hyattsville. Commissioner Varna is passionate about ensuring that the next generation has real opportunities, particularly in housing and land use. He is a passionate and advocate supporter of his community in Forest Glen, Maryland. And he started a blog called Finding Forest Glen, which was the first digital form for the neighborhood. He's an active resident in Forest Glen, in the Forest Glen community, and serves as executive director of Sierra Club. He's also a mediator and a panel attorney for the for the Montgomery Department of Housing and the Community Affairs Commission on the Common Ownership Communities. So he has a legal background, and he adds to this conversation as a decision maker. He has a degree in political science from the University of Maryland, College Park. Again, it's a very small world. And a law degree from Penn State, from Pennsylvania State University School of Law, along with certifications in transnational law from Duke and the University of London. Commissioner Varma has a legal background, again, and has worked at the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Department of State, the counselor in Turkey, the counselor's office in Turkey and India, as well as a task force supporting crisis around the world. His preferred pronouns, Commissioner Varna's preferred pronouns are his, him, and he. Welcome to all of you, and I thank you very much for joining us. So our first topic of discussion is that which is related to trust, and trust as being the guts of connectedness. I really like that phrase. How do we create this brave and safe space? And I'm going to ask this of Megan Baca first. How do you think, what is our duty as planners when addressing the LGBT community? What are some of the stories that you've been hearing within the community about trust and building trust in the community? Validating oral histories is important. So how do we deal with the content and the data of stories that's necessary and suitable for creating a safe space, a safe and brave space? Megan?
Yes, thank you very much. So again, this is Meg Baca from Preservation Maryland. My preferred pronouns are they, them, theirs. As a professional preservationist and as an amateur historian and as a member of the LGBTQ community, all of these identities I think that we all have are kind of wonderfully represented, and the ability to speak about them openly is not something that people necessarily of my community were always able to do. When I think of them, one of the very interesting things about LGBTQ history is a lot of the history was self-collected. So if communities and groups weren't getting the support in terms of medicine and job opportunities and things like that, you can think, what are the challenges that a community like the LGBTQ community had, but still had a pride and a feeling within themselves that what they were doing was worth preserving. So I think it's really interesting. A lot of the major archives were started in folks' basements. I know an example from Buffalo, where I'm from. It was a collection called the Madeline Davis collection, and she and her partner and friends had this collection in their basement for quite some time. And just within the past, I think 5 years, the local state university there, Buffalo State, included it into its archive. So I think in terms of trust, and it's a great place to start, is there wasn't always, but there was always a trust within the community itself that, you know, there would be, it will get better. People will recognize our life for the value that it has. So I think that there are organizations that are trying to approach kind of that olive branch, and so that Buffalo State taking that collection. I know the Maryland Historical Society has an open LGBTQ collection, and they're working on changing what those donation forms might look like. So maybe it can be anonymous, maybe the pronouns are different. So that's just a good example of, you know, where larger institutions are going. Preservation Maryland is part of a statewide collaborative that's working on documenting all of Maryland's LGBTQ history, which is a huge task. And I've got the draft document here. Both Jeremy and Free have helped us with that and are reading it. And one of the major tenets that is part of that research is we hosted last Pride Month, so June 2019, we hosted some community meetings where, especially with this type of public history, it's not going to be as well documented. So you have to create safe spaces where people can start to tell their own stories and to document them as they're told. I think that with this type of narrative, I think you do have to be careful and respectful. And I think it's new. And if historians are doing their job ethically, there's an ethics to history. It's a great example of public history and perhaps how public history should have always been done, and is a great example of how it can be done by trusting the community members to speak for themselves. And I think that's a really, what's happening with LGBTQ public history and preservation, I think is just a great example for moving forward with all communities that are currently underrepresented.
Thank you, Meg. I want to apologize. I messed up on your pronouns, and I just want to acknowledge that. But I also, you know, I have a you know, confession to make. You know, pronouns are new to me. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate on the usage and our ability to be comfortable with using those pronouns, because it's so ingrained in us and so much a part of our, you know, culture to kind of assume things about people and their identity. So I just wanted to kind of ask a personal question about, you know, being able to use those and feeling comfortable with using pronouns, and just giving you a chance to elaborate on that. Meg?
Sure. And so this is Meg again. Thank you for that. Thank you for asking. It definitely in earlier times of my life was not a happy thing that I felt non-binary, and I didn't have representation for the experiences I was having, both internally and emotionally and physically and things. And I think it's really interesting about LGBTQ history is, I mean, to keep it G or PG, I mean, we are kind of forced to open ourselves up in a very vulnerable way. And so I'm just kind of letting that sink in, because it is a very personal thing for a lot of us to talk about. So for me, the pronouns is actually a recent change in my life. I recently had gender affirming top surgery. My partner and my family are very supportive of it. And so I identify, honestly, I'm still kind of picking some of the letters that identify me. And I guess to bring this back out and how it might be helpful for other people who don't necessarily know, LGBTQ, all of those letters within the acronym both represent gender identity and sexual orientation. That does not mean you can only be one, does not mean if you're one, you can't be the other. So I think what's very interesting about LGBTQ history, and we're all getting used to that acronym, and although those other letters can be included, there's a diversity within our own community. And I think, again, speaking to the power of LGBTQ history for the future of public history, not everybody's experiences are the same. And even in the time that I've known Jeremy, when we were in Clemson, I've changed dramatically since knowing him, but we still are colleagues. And I think being able to openly talk about your changes and your experiences in life will only lead to a better profession, and that level of connectedness, being able to be open, like Gwen was saying, will allow us all to be connected more strongly. So great question, happy to answer it. Again, it's a safe space, so don't have to apologize about the pronouns. That's the whole point of it being a safe space, and we're all here to learn from each other, so thank you.
Thank you, Meg. I wanted to open the floor up to some of the other panelists to maybe elaborate if you wanted to, if you had anything to share about trust. Jeremy?
So my perspective is going to be really strongly related to planning, because that's where a lot of my research and teaching is. And it's one of the things that I discovered about safe places when I was helping my students to do a research project on the LGBTQ community in Baltimore, is the importance of when you're engaging with members of and again, we have to be careful when I think of like the members of the LGBTQ community, as Meg has rightfully pointed out, there's a diversity there, and so there's not homogeneity. There's different identities, and you have to recognize it, especially if you're trying to understand the community, how those play out. And if you're trying to get representation, you need to make sure to reach out to gay people and lesbian people, transgender people, and understand that relationship, especially historically, because one of the challenges that my students had was like oral history interviews to interview members of the community that might identify, for instance, as lesbian, but they weren't really out. And so there's a lot about the work that we were doing about making sure to guarantee people's confidentiality, to make sure that, I mean, the safe space, not only being where and how we're communicating, but the physical place, to make sure that we're entirely honoring what people want, in terms of, they're taking a risk to some extent to share some very sensitive information. And for those of us who do planning, we just really need to be aware of that. And I put that in the context that planning, it writ large, is often, even though we are trying to not have it be this way, as a top-down kind of an enterprise, where we say we're going to have a public meeting, or members of the public, you come to us. When we're dealing with sensitive members of the community who might be marginalized by this kind of an interaction, we just need to be aware of that. We have to reach out to them.
Commissioner Varna?
I think trust is a really important component in the entire process, not only from a planning perspective, but also as decision makers. We want to make sure that we're not only having the entire community represented, but there's a level of transparency and public engagement, especially in a time where people don't have as much faith in government services. And I think that's something that should always be in the back of our minds, is what level of service are we providing, what level of transparency, and most importantly, are we in fact representing our most vulnerable populations? And these are people who may not be the typical stakeholder or community participant. When I was running for commissioner, one of the things the county did was the Queer Democrats of Montgomery County had an LGBT forum on planning issues, which was very, I think it was the first time it was done. And even though we were asked a lot of questions about planning in generic terms, and one of the questions that was asked was, what kind of planning issues face LGBT members or community members? And what are some of the issues that we can address in planning? And it was a difficult question to ask because, you know, how do you decipher what are some of the issues one group might be feeling or is underrepresented, and how do we address it? Or how do we tackle these issues in a kind of customized manner when we're talking about a group that traditionally hasn't had any representation? And I gave my own experience of a friend of mine who is gender nonconforming and had a situation where she did not feel comfortable picking up her car from a car mechanic in a rural part of Maryland. Something as simple as picking up your own car because of the community that was there. And so she called me and said, hey, can you pick up my car for me? I'm in this really difficult situation. And I did. And that level of trust that this person was in my neighborhood, I saw this person on a regular basis. To what extent planning allows us to develop these kind of relationships where we're building communities, where people have gathering spaces, where we're designing homes, where people can effectively engage and build that trust within the community, that is so important. And I think it's often not discussed. And for a lot of people who are in the more vulnerable areas, or like I said, gender nonconforming, questioning, there could even be some insecurity there on their physical appearance. And they may not be as open as a typical neighbor, for instance, in engaging their communities. How do we create scenarios where people are seeing each other, are trusting each other? And I think that's a part of the planning process that's often not discussed.
So we're going to kick it to Free, but thank you so much.
So I wanted to share at least two examples as I was listening on the idea of trust. One dealing with race, the other dealing with orientation or identity. In terms of my work, one of the first jobs that I had at the National Trust for Historic Preservation was as program coordinator of their African American Historic Places initiative. And as you're listening to me, but seeing me, when I would engage with folks on the phone and talking with African Americans, asking about historic African American historic places, I would get resistance. I could hear it. And what I would do to gain that element of trust was I would say, oh, well, by the way, when my grandfather was at Hampton Institute, within seconds, you could hear your grandfather went to Hampton. Oh, and the floodgates open. So we were able to have that conversation, and I understood the idea that, okay, this is what I need to do in order to gain trust, because I want to get this job done, but I also wanted at the time to make sure that the people I was engaging understood that the National Trust was actually interested in African American historic places, and that they had entrusted me with that particular task. A current job that I'm working on right now is I will be putting together an historic context study for Raleigh, North Carolina's LGBTQ historic places. So what is going to be interesting is that I, as a Virginian, dare I say it, and not from Raleigh, I'm going to need, because I do incorporate oral history in everything, in all the work that I do, I'm going to need to gain that element of trust with people who don't know me, who may see me as an outsider, wondering what it is that I'm doing, and perhaps being an out gay man may not necessarily be enough. but I do want to make sure, but but it's a part of my goal, and certainly the goal of the city, to ensure that they have that sense of trust, and it's my responsibility to help incorporate that in the work that I do in terms of historic preservation. So I wanted to add that.
That's very insightful because, me as a Black woman, I can completely understand that, and being able to relate to someone and feel like they can relate to you and they can see you, like Commissioner Partap and Megan were saying, it's so important. It's so important when you're trying to do community outreach and engagement, more so engagement. Which takes us to our next question. So you guys are transitioning very well, and I'm gonna ask this of Commissioner Varma. What do you think is the role of the planning department as it relates to connectedness, but also in the preservation of history and being able to tell those stories and to understand those stories, establishing a community's history and culture over time is hard work. It takes a village, and we don't take those things for granted. But what experience or stories can you share or speak to lessons that you've learned along the way when it comes to community advocacy or mobilizing community members to get involved, like yourself? Commissioner Varma?
Well, that history is so important, and I think people don't often realize the connection between a community's shared history and even potential impact on the direction you may want to go in the future. The issues we're facing today in 2020 are a lot different than what we were facing in 2000, in 1980, in 1970 or 1960s. And how do we make sure that we are preserving not only spaces that are relevant to a community's shared history, but also making sure that oral history is being captured as part of the decision-making process. That is often something that's not completely captured. And I think that connectedness that Director Gwen Wright was referring to as part of our general plan is ensuring that we are capturing those artifacts, that we are capturing those important historical and qualitative data is a good way of putting it. When I was doing my own community outreach, I discovered that there was so much happening in my neighborhood that even though we had this vibrant history that's well documented in Forest Glen, which goes back to the 1700s, not many people realize that. I mean, John Carroll, the founder of Georgetown University, is buried a block from me. The first Catholic church by an archbishop is in Forest Glen in the entire United States. And then, of course, the famous National Park Seminary, which was a famous girls' finishing school. There's a castle. There's a former brothel that apparently U.S. presidents used to venture in. And there was even a train station where you could take a train to New York City back in the day. Lots going on. But there's also a history that was discovered that wasn't that old, that people could say, hey, this was a part of the community that was once used in a certain way. We lost that and we would like to bring that back. Or these are the people historically that haven't had a voice in this community that are still here that want to be relevant. So capturing that is so important, and you can really only do that if you're having an effective mechanism for dialogue. And I'm so glad that we're able to do that at the planning department, being agile, being dynamic, especially in the uncertain times like COVID-19 and general unrest in this country. We have to adapt with the times. And I do hope we don't have another global pandemic, but this isn't going to be the only time we're going to be doing these kind of Zoom and Teams video conferences. There are going to be other scenarios, and more importantly, maybe this is going to be a way for us to encourage other people who otherwise could not participate because of other constraints, that a digital platform is now being integrated in the way we do planning. So we're already doing that in the planning department. We've had an incredible amount of participation. And so the connectedness is definitely something that we constantly have to work at. If you're not working on it, you're probably slacking. And I think that's something that we have to always keep in mind.
Yes, I totally agree. I want to open the floor up, and I see that Free has a comment he would like to add.
Sure, just the general sense of wanting that sense of connection. I think it's going to be bringing a sense of connection with the sense of trust. A quick anecdote, one thing I remember, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this is Montgomery County, the community of Clarksburg, I believe it is, or is it Clarksville? In sort of toward Gate, it's past, I think it's past Gaithersburg.
It's Clarksburg, that's correct.
Clarksburg, okay, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that used to be an African American community, historically speaking. My point being that in the sense of bringing a sense of trust into a discussion and tying it in with the idea of bringing in oral history, I think it's just absolutely important to make sure that when you're engaging with community, that in the process of getting something like an oral history, the clues that you get in those conversations that can lead to new information is particularly important, I think. So for someone like me, again, doing research generally in African American historic places, I did not know that there was a significant African American community in Montgomery County that was an historic one, because, you know, for someone who lived in Washington, D.C., as both a child and as an adult, I've always thought of Montgomery County as a suburb, as a suburban community, and never really put together the idea of those longer historic ties. So again, when you think about it, moving it to the LGBTQ realm, I think that you're gonna find there are some interesting tidbits of history that are currently unknown with regard to, say, Montgomery County's LGBTQ and I history, that, you know, conversations like these, conversations that you'll further have in the planning process, will come out. And I am really looking forward for everyone there to discover the new things that will come out through even more. You know, we had the context study for Maryland, but things can go even deeper. We can't capture everything in one particular document all the time, because there may be people who aren't ready to speak yet. There may be those who don't necessarily want their stories out. I've done research, I did research for the National Park Service, and remembered that I had to talk about same gender loving communities as opposed to gay or lesbian communities. And by virtue of doing that, there may be people who would be willing to talk to me because I respected the same gender loving verbiage as opposed to gay, lesbian, or bi. Do you understand where I'm going with this? So it is that sense
Yes.
of being open and using you know, the tools that we have to try to build that trust, to show a connectivity, and then, you know, move forward with regard to planning. So that's what I wanted to add.
This
Thank
is
you,
Megan.
Free. I'm going to
yes,
give it to
thank
you. Go
Free.
ahead, Megan.
This is Megan. And for a little bit about the historic context, and Free might know the actual dates, and I'm not sure, but the whole concept of LGBTQ is a construction of the past century. So if we really go back in history, people have certainly been having these experiences and feelings, but how do you document them using current language? And, you know, maybe the next cohort of Jeremy's students will be figuring out how you do that even better moving into the future. I did want to mention a couple places, because Partap mentioned some, and Free, you did as well. I know in the report, we were focusing on a diversity of locations across the state, but Montgomery County, because it does have one of the highest populations of LGBTQ households from a 2010 census report that's current from 2010. But historically, there's a couple sites that I just want to mention. You can read the context study for more, and our intention is that the context study, which will be released later this month or early in July, we tried to get it done in Pride Month, but things have been crazy. That we know that this report is a first step. So then counties like Montgomery County, like Prince George's County, like Baltimore City, can start to use this as a basis of documentation for sites that are more relevant to local history. Similar how to the 2016 National Park Service LGBTQ context study laid the groundwork for states, so Maryland, and the only other state to do it was Kentucky, to pick up that history and take it from this national level to the state level. So in Montgomery County, we have major protests at NIH related to AIDS and lack of treatment and medical care for primarily gay men and others who had HIV. There was a firing of a gay teacher in Parkland Middle School in the 70s that we're looking into further as a really early documentation of employment discrimination. And then there are also some, the concept of like retroactively outing somebody is totally for a different discussion where we have just historians instead of planners on the call. But we do know that Rachel Carson had a very long relationship with another woman. And of course, her house, which she designed, both the house and gardens, is in Silver Spring. So there's just some great examples from a range of places. And the context study will be out later this month. And already we got additional funding from the National Park Service's Certified Local Government Program to do National Register nominations in Baltimore City, the first in Maryland related to LGBTQ history, and 2 Maryland Inventory of Historic Places, which is just a long way of saying kind of the state register will be done in Montgomery County. And we've been working really closely with Rebecca Ballo and in the Montgomery County Planning Department. So they've been already a great partner in doing some of the firsts in the state related to LGBTQ history.
Thanks, Meg. I just wanted to also make some folks aware that we do have some questions. I highly encourage you to send us questions. So I'm going to just hop over to, before I go to Commissioner Pharma, can we just address just 2 questions? Go Terps, I do see you, Laura. We have a question from Chuck Hines about the LGBTQ acronym. And although we have some information posted here in the chat, I just wanted to give our panel some time to kind of explain a little bit about the acronym and what we are not seeing, the plus sign. What does the plus sign include? I'm going to toss it over to Meg to answer this question, if you don't mind.
Sure. And I think it's a great question, and I responded in the chat. Again, as LGBTQ history is an example of difficult planning in public history, it's always changing, right? What Free mentioned, what I mentioned about how other people in history wouldn't have represented themselves in different ways, societal, religious, all sorts of different frameworks were included in this. So I really think that the question is, how do you create, and part of this whole connectedness is, how do you make sure that people feel connected by that acronym or not in that acronym, but to participate in their planning? So planning is good citizenship. If you are gay and you don't feel like you're being seen or heard by your own county, you're likely either going to participate a lot and be a squeaky wheel, right? Hand up. But you could also just feel completely diminished by not being represented. So I think there's additional reading that folks can do about that. And the challenge is, it's not a homogenous group, like Jeremy said. So actually, so we could continue to talk about that. I just think it's a challenge in addition to a challenge. But in terms of inclusive design, like physical design, the concept is that inclusive design actually works better for everybody, and public history should work better for everybody. And so if we put that in our mindset, then what we're learning here shouldn't be just LGBTQ folks talking about LGBTQ history. It's really wonderful when we have allies in different departments and different arenas joining us. So that's why I so much appreciate Jeremy too, just being an ally and taking his preservation perspective into this framework and giving it that professional lens as he would. I have one more thing to say and then I'll jump off. Is like Free was saying about this Maryland report. It's not like one book was ever written about the Civil War in Maryland, right? You don't need just one. There's going to be hopefully a groundswell, and part of that is making sure people feel more comfortable and continue to dig in that history. And new things will come up that support what has been said, and sometimes they will come up that will contradict it. And that's all part of being part of the historic record. And that's a point of pride. It's like you got to be in there to even start having conversations. So I just really appreciate that this discussion is happening on that level.
I agree. I agree. There is not one book on Civil War, and we do have one other question before I get to Commissioner Varma about tours. In the planning department specifically, I don't think that we have those set up, but we are actively working to do some research on LGBT plus communities and the history that is the stories that need to be told. But if anyone knows offhand anything in addition to that, I think we do have a response here in the Q&A, but I open it up if anyone knows anything in particular that you've seen as of recently that maybe we should be mindful of. I mean, I think we can learn from Washington, D.C. and the city of Baltimore, because they do have tours, as you just brought up, Meg, about some of the tours that they offer. So does anyone have any words on that as far as tours are concerned? If not, I will turn it over to Commissioner Varma. I do believe you had a comment, and I hope that we haven't gone too far off the track, that you forgot your comment from connectedness, the discussion of connectedness.
No, I wanted to address something that Megan mentioned with regards to our history, and some of the residents, particularly in Montgomery County. It kind of reminded me that when I was appointed as commissioner, a lot of people were saying, oh, he's the first LGBT commissioner in Montgomery County. And I kind of paused and I thought about it. I said, well, openly gay, right? And that's an important thing that I think is part of our history, our shared history, is that so many people before me, probably, in fact, someone recently mentioned to me that there was another gay commissioner before me, which maybe could be part of our history that we were talking about, and I'll plan on doing some more research on that and get back to you. But that's also part of our history, is that for so many years we were in the closet and we did not feel comfortable for a wide variety of reasons, as we all know, for not being able to come out and be ourselves. Even myself, even within my own kind of history, I came out in 2011 at a time where even in the federal government, I would hear things in seemingly progressive offices and be like, so much for trying to come out this month, and I would kind of kick the can down the road. Also being South Asian, which is traditionally a conservative community, there weren't a lot, if any, South Asian representation in the LGBT community. And so I think that's going to be definitely part of the historical element in Montgomery County. You're not going to have as much some of history that's going to be readily apparent. You're going to have to dig a little bit. And I think that's definitely part of our shared history. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think we also have we have a few comments in the Q&A here, but one that kind of asks about how do we plan to welcome and spotlight by pan-queer people, families, especially when they are in households with partners and are assumed to be straight or gay. I think, Meg, you've responded, but I just wanted to allow you some time to kind of elaborate on your response here. Meg?
Sure. So this discussion is about making people feel welcome and invited, and within the community, which we've discussed is very broad in and of itself. And I don't know if in the future, but I know in the future, just like when you read a dissertation title, it's like this group of people in this place in this 6-month period, right? Those experiences that people are having who are bi or non-conforming or changing, who hasn't changed, right? Like in any given way in their history and in their lives. And I think that the questions are often about that erasure within its own community are really difficult, and you can feel sometimes the emotion behind them. I do think there are great examples of there's intersectionality within LGBTQ, and just as like a positive reference, I'll say a lot of what's happening with the either Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black people is specifically including Black trans lives, which I've seen at the protests. I've been here in New Haven, and I've seen in other places in Baltimore and things like that. So I think just this conversation should, even though it's not perfect, and there are very few historic records that we can even go to, but I think more things will come to light as there is more research. So if you are interested in seeing your community represented, let's do an oral history in your community. Let's get your thoughts on life on paper. And it's only from that past documentation that we've been telling our own stories instead of historians creating a narrative around those stories. So I think just being here and asking that question, whoever asked it, I really appreciate that and know that it's a challenge. And it looks like Free has something, hopefully you can help me with this question too.
Well, what I wanted to do really quickly was add a little weight and let's say let's pass through time. If we think about the ACT UP actions at the NIH, and you look at the actions that they were doing at the time, bring it forward and think about Black Lives Matter, which has pretty much been a Black, queer, organized, and led in some respects, depending on how you define it, event. If you think about it that way and bring those two ideas together, think about the connection between ACT UP all the way through to Black Lives Matter, and you're looking at activism that is queer-related activism about queer lives and all of those things. And I wanted to get that out before I forgot, because I keep wanting to remind people who I've seen within the gay community who have had negative things to say about Black Lives Matter, and I want to remind them that if you want to do a criticism on one, that I need you to go back when we were looking at ACT UP and being very proud of what they were doing, fighting for their lives, if you will, our lives. Then bring it forward and just change the look of some of the people, and you have that connection. So I just wanted to really drive that point home, particularly as a reminder during Pride Month, we celebrate the Stonewall riots with all the people who participated in that, in riots. Just saying. That's it. I hope that helped.
Yes, it did help. Helps a lot. And you guys are moving into our next topic. So, history and change are very much aligned with one another, and there's a lot of history in the making. And so we want to talk about this concept of history in real time. And we are living through history now. It is amazing at how much stuff is happening. I'm so glad that you brought up Black Lives Matter. And so I want to pose this first question to Jeffrey Free Harris. Well, I wanted to ask you, how can we preserve history in real time? What do you think about the history that's being made today?
that interesting. Okay, I've really got to put my historian hat on right now. One of the interesting things I will say that took place down at Lafayette Square, specifically the tagging of the side of Decatur House, if you will, on H Street. There was a tagging. And I wish I could remember specifically what it said, but it was something to the effect of, why do we keep having to talk about Black lives? I think something like that, spray painted on the side of Decatur House. What is most likely the case in my mind would be that the person who did that likely didn't know that that was pretty much where the slave quarters of Decatur House was located. So that the tag, in my mind, transcended almost 2 centuries. That question was a 2 centuries worth of question on a building that's been preserved, with an organization, the National Trust and the White House Historical Association, that has talked about that specific history. So, for example, there is a discussion about whether or not to preserve that on the side of the building in some way, shape, or form, sort of making that connection. And I've made the argument that I think there's a good reason to do that. But I think that we really do need to think hard about how we're going from a preservation perspective, I'll put it, and ultimately a planning perspective as well. How are we going to keep track of, identify, and contextualize, say, Black Lives Matter sites for clearly the events that are happening today, on that issue? Also expanding what we know about the NIH with regard to the pandemic that's going on as we speak. These are things that you all now are the planners now are going to have to tackle, that historians are going to create narratives for, but that's why oral histories are important, so that we can follow a lead as opposed to creating a narrative out of what we believe is said. And then preservationists are going to be able to preserve those spaces. And I hope I'm not sounding too obtuse, but it's just going to be a lot of work to do what's necessary, I think, to really mark what's happening and put it within a proper historic context, so that those who come after us understand what was going on. Those who have relationships, as I brought up with ACT UP, can see the connections that exist from past actions with current actions. And those who are not yet with us really can understand what it was that we were going through, and hopefully they can look back at it and say, wow, that was a very different time. I hope that is helpful.
It's very helpful. And I will say that nowadays with technology, we all have a cell phone of some sort. And so those cameras have been showing us images. I want to think images that we might not have seen before. So it is the time to record your stories. And I 100% agree with you. I'm going to pass the ball to Jeremy to also respond to this question of history in real time, and what are your thoughts about what we're seeing today?
Yeah, so one of the things that history in general does when we practice it is it's a filtering mechanism, because when we look at things that have happened in the past, there's always a discarding that's happening there. There's lots of history that never gets recorded. It's not in people's memories, or no one bothers to talk to people to record those memories. And so that just gets lost forever. It's interesting when you think about history happening as it's unfolding in front of our eyes. What do we selectively choose to record, to keep, and sort of to keep an eye out, I suppose, for the future of the significance being important when it becomes the past. That's kind of complicated. But one of the things that structurally happens in preservation that we're constrained by when we do historic preservation because a lot of it happens like design review that's happening in Montgomery County, recognition of local historic districts, recognition of national historic districts. We have the 50-year rule, which is technically a guideline, but is very rigidly enforced quite often. That magically things don't become history until they meet a 50-year threshold. It's really interesting to think how that came about. I'm going to make a little plug here for historian John Sprinkle, who wrote a whole book about how the criteria in the National Register were created. That 50-year rule is a result of a political process. It's arbitrary and related to the Civil War. You can read the book to get more details. The reason I say that is the arbitrary way that we treat what's important in the past in official historic preservation practice is arbitrary. There's no reason that we have to have that 50-year rule in place all the time. And having that slide up more to the present is more important, especially when we're looking at events unfolding before us in real time. I mean, certainly when we look at, one of the biggest events around the Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, we should be recording all of that. I mean, I doubt if any historian looking back at 50 years wouldn't think that this is important. But if you look at, it could be that, pride activities, need to be documented more. We need to look for more patterns. We also need to look for patterns in terms of, we've already talked about the language that people use to describe themselves as part of the LGBTQ community and how that evolves and how that can inform even how we look at the past. So it's complicated. I don't think there's any easy answer to how we do this in the present, other than to be aware of our biases, that we always need to figure out what is preventing us from recognizing history as it's happening now, especially in a structural regulatory environment.
Thank you, Jeremy. We have some questions in the Q&A. I want to toss some on the floor here. There's a question that we did respond to, but I want to pose it to the group. How do we participate in these oral histories? I think the Rainbow History Project is something that Megan is very aware of. So I wanted to give her an opportunity to kind of share with the group and those who may have the same question about how do we participate in these oral histories?
Sure. So the Rainbow History Project operates primarily out of DC. And again, it's one of those examples of, for us, by us, these are our archives. We take the archives. They train volunteers for oral histories. And as far as I know, they're an all volunteer organization. What happened to a lot of the LGBTQ focused organizations in Maryland after marriage equality, so Equality Maryland and others, were, after kind of this great achievement, we're kind of retooling, and how do you continue to serve the community? A great example is how early AIDS clinics, including Chase Brexton, now is a health center that I go to in Baltimore that accepts everybody and everyone, and specializes in LGBTQ healthcare, but is also a health center and clinic for everybody. So in terms of the oral histories, participating in a group that already exists is great. There is definitely a need for an LGBTQ history something, and maybe we're getting close to that. Preservation Maryland has received 2 grants from the state to do the work that we're currently doing. So of course there needs to be financial support and buy-in from the community and support. So this is a great example of a county doing something this session, also working with the planning department to do the Maryland inventory forms. So in terms of the oral history project, I know StoryCorps has an app, and you can do that, and then you can submit that to StoryCorps on NPR. You can get in touch with Rainbow History Project, and then also recognize that we're definitely in this building stage of what LGBTQ history looks like. So if you've got these questions and you've got the energy, it's definitely a great time to participate in that, which folks are already doing by being here on this call.
Thank you, Meg. I'm going to also ask a question. I'm gonna go Jenna has a question about how do the speakers feel about using the modern LGBT+ abbreviation Is it ethical to use these platforms' data for historic preservation? How would studying these digital gathering spaces yield results when compared to the history of brick and mortar spaces, physical spaces, I guess? I want to turn it over to Jeremy because the next topic that we're going to be discussing actually transitions well into the significance of place. And I think it might also kind of speak to this question of, ethical or ethics. Jeremy?
Yeah, sure. So really actually in relation to the question that you asked, there's a lot of talk that happens in historic preservation about intangible history and heritage and addressing it within practice. And I think it's interesting when you look at a lot about the various dimensions of LGBTQ culture, that of course before we had online environments was very physical in terms of there were places people went, places that people connected, and that's been virtualized, which I think was what the questioner got into in terms of what that's about. And so there's a culture, in a sense, that's been virtualized in the online environment. And I don't know, in my impression, that's the history and the significance of that hasn't really been well addressed. It really ought to be, and we're talking about, even things like Grindr, that obviously are serving as places of connection for people with shared interests. What does it actually look like in the terms of manifestation of heritage? These are really interesting questions that I think we really need to understand. And is there still some potential overlap here with how that actually works? But in terms of this idea of intangible heritage, the big issue in preservation, in terms of what I call the preservation enterprise, and other people are beginning to refer to, is that about 3/4 of the practice that we do, federal level and state and local levels, the reason why it exists and the reason why these people's jobs exist is because it's specified in a particular regulation. It might be at the federal level that we have to do something called Section 106 review. It is certainly at the local level, where I've already mentioned design review in local historic districts. And the regulations, if you read them and look at what it is they're trying to help people understand about why a historical place is significant, there's absolutely nothing there that connects with intangible heritage. And so as preservation practitioners, as planners, that space needs to be opened up. And my argument would be that space needs to be opened up within the regulatory environment, especially when we have, like Montgomery County is, I think, a bit different than this, as are some other planning entities that will provide money and time and resources to planning departments and commissions to work on things not related to the regulatory environment and historic preservation. And then you can go outside the regulatory environment and do the extra work, like LGBTQ tours, for instance. But there's a lot of, at the local level, especially, and certainly at the federal level and the National Park Service, that if it's not in a rule or regulation, we don't do it. We can't do it. And so now we have kind of what people refer to as a freezing or an ossification of practice that prevents historic preservation practice from recognizing intangible heritage. And so much of intangible heritage relates to what is important to LGBTQ communities. It also relates to what's really important to a lot of marginalized communities, because if you happen to be part of the privileged class in the United States, if you're rich and you're white, your history has long been recorded in abundance. So lots of written documentation. You have your high-style buildings, material culture everything is just more prevalent. It's much more physical. We have to work much harder at trying to get at that intangible heritage with marginalized communities, certainly including the LGBTQ community. And my question, certainly to practitioners in the field, is how are we going to work harder at making sure that these stories are heard and influence practice beyond the regulatory environment, or even the big white elephant in the room, no pun intended, the regulatory environment? How do we crack that box open? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Jeremy. I just wanted to clear up something really quickly before Meg goes. I totally botched that question, by the way, Mrs. Madeline Jackson. I really had no idea what Grindr was. So I apologize, Jenna, but thank you very much, Jeremy, for rebounding on that. I think, Megan, you have some things that you wanted to add to that as well.
See, it's a safe space for these things. And Jeremy, I just think that's such a great, what I think Jeremy brings to the conversation is this concept of preservation and regulation using LGBTQ as an example, but not the only example. So the breadth of perspective about how this is one community that was kind of left behind in the historic record, and what we can do to change that. And I'd never heard you say that turn of phrase, which is to then what we're learning here to then influence federal regulations, which I think is, you know, exactly a mic drop moment. The sites that are going to be important for LGBTQ folks throughout history, because of kind of diminished social status or lack of finances or things like that, just being underrepresented in general, our historic sites are going to look much different than the places that we all, you know, went on school field trips and things like that. And so there are changes in how the profession needs to look at what a place has integrity and why it's important. And perhaps that architecture is not beautiful, right? So for example, one of Jeremy's students who we got to work with did a lot of research about Phase 1 in DC, which when I read that report, you know, it's got this storefront that you'd be like, I never even want to go in there. It's got this door with the world's smallest window. I mean, it's like painted brown, like it's a garage, you know. And the reason it was like that was because it was putting up this wall of saying, you can't come in, but when you're in, it's a safe place. So actually the grit of the architecture was creating the space for people. But if you just architecturally looked at it, you wouldn't. Now, of course, that's exactly why big buildings are big buildings, right? Because architecture speaks to what expresses what people are trying to say through built heritage. So the connectedness, so if architecture and connectedness and planning all kind of come together, the places that we'll be looking at and these great questions about looking at Grindr or looking at her or something else, we do need to change how we're looking at that. Now, I wouldn't hold my breath that all these changes are going to happen at the federal level, folks. So I think this in the county, having this representation in its council and in its regional plan is going to be somewhere where residents and citizens can get more actively engaged much quicker until, you know, Jeremy figures out the whole rest of the stuff, you know? So that's kind of, things are going to look different and we do have to change that. So tours, apps, signs, instead of making things, you know, a static historic site will probably happen. I'd also love to see interventions and influences in historic sites that are not historic sites because of LGBTQ history. But I know London Town, which is a colonial living history museum in Edgewater in Anne Arundel County, is including LGBTQ history, even though they don't have a document that says an LGBTQ person lived here, worked here, moved here, anything, but knowing that they are likely represented, but it wouldn't be documented. And they're also working on having more inclusive tours. So a great example is don't immediately make the boy kid hold a gun and the girl go into the kitchen. Let people experience other gender roles as children at historic sites. Don't gender somebody when you call on them. Don't say ladies and gentlemen. There's some really basic stuff that we can do to just kind of widen that umbrella. And I think make people feel more welcome, kind of like what we've heard in the comments too, is to try and just make people know that museums and history are a safe place. And certainly I think this approach is getting us there. It is moving us forward.
Awesome, awesome. We're going to turn it over to Commissioner Varna to add comments to that.
Sure. I wanted to provide a slightly different perspective, and this is just all in the context of what we're dealing with today with Black Lives Matter, the recent incidences that have shaken our country, our communities, in some cases disproportionately, like COVID-19. I think, since Jeremy mentioned a regulatory process, there's always going to be a healthy tension between what we want to preserve and where do we want to go in the realm of planning. And I do want to all of us stop for a second and recognize that historical preservation is a privilege. And I want to expand on that thought for a second. If you are a community that has the luxury of talking about preservation, when there are people who are within the LGBT community, people of color, immigrants, who do not have the fundamental options or access to housing or transit, we have to be a little bit mindful and careful on how we are capturing history when there could be a tension between giving our county residents hope for the future. And that is something that I think we need to be mindful of, particularly in a county like Montgomery County that has a history of exclusionary zoning, which has racist elements to it, redlining. We know even with this bi-county commission that we are a part of, we know how Prince George's County and Montgomery County were developed, where transit went, where it did not go, where the businesses went, where the federal government decided to put its auxiliary sites. Montgomery County was predominantly a white county up until recently. Why housing has gotten so expensive in places like Tacoma Park, where there was tons of affordable housing, and today a bungalow near walking distance to the metro can cost $800,000, $900,000. Recognizing that members of our community do not enjoy often higher salaries, do not have access, in some cases, to higher education, have been stunted by a society that did not recognize us only until recently. And even then, we have not made it to a point where we are on an equal platform. So you throw in elements of LGBT issues, you have elements of people of color. We see that in this county, how we are divided, the East-West divide. And I just want to be, I think we need to constantly remember that, because we are in a place of privilege when we are talking about preservation. There are legitimate issues facing our county, our country today. And, there is going to be this tension of like, do we preserve or do we move forward? And there are going to be times where they're going to be difficult decisions. We have to make them every day at the planning board when we have an application before us. There's history, and then there's a question of, is it in the case of an architectural analysis, is it worth preserving, given what it could potential higher and best use of a certain parcel. So these are questions that we are constantly dealing with. So I just wanted to put it out there because I do think that it's easy for us to be in our respective bubbles, and I use that word respectfully because I have been known to be in my own bubble plenty of times, and I've had people shake me and say, well, wait a second, Pratap, you need to take this perspective in mind. And I do think that should always be part of our narrative.
Yeah, that is awesome. I wanted to just tell you that you touched on something great that actually has a lot to do with the historic preservation enterprise that that Jeremy has brought to our attention. So I just want to kind of toss it over to Jeremy to elaborate on the historic preservation enterprise. I do want to do a time check really quickly. It's 1:19 right now. We're going to open it up for questions right after Jeremy. Jeremy?
Okay. So I'll try to make this brief. So one of the things that's been remarkable about what's happened with the Black Lives Movement is it's catalyzed some really frank discussion in historic preservation about its systemic racism that's part of the preservation enterprise, which is, broadly speaking, work related again around the regulatory environment and at a much smaller level, how we interpret historic sites, things that happen within architectural design, and downtown revitalization. It's mostly that regulatory environment. And there's two things I wanted to mention along that, that I would suggest everybody here, if you're kind of curious what this conversation is and what's actually happening. There's an author by the name of Frank Bagnoni, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, author of the Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums. And he has posted essentially sort of like 9 theses of the systemic racism and preservation, where he details a lot of really what the fundamental problems are in terms of how racism tends to permeate the field. And I just wanted to summarize here real quickly what this looks like to give people here who aren't really familiar with what preservation is and how it's taught and where it comes from. So there's basically seven things here that I'm going to be focusing on. The first one being that the way that we teach and reinforce our value system in historic preservation are based on something we actually call doctrines in preservation, and they're entirely based on the ideas of white men, usually from the 19th century, usually from European traditions. So the basic premise on what we practice preservation, what's encoded in laws and regulations, is inherently white supremacism. The second one is that only about 1% of historic preservation practitioners are non-white. We have no diversity in the field. Pretty much, it just doesn't exist. Most of the students who enter historic preservation programs to get a degree in the field, they're also entirely white. The people who are teaching in historic preservation programs, in the programs across the country, who are tenured or are tenure track, and they have more than a 50% appointment to teaching, there are no African American professors in that field, and there's basically no people of color. Most of the people who volunteer in historic preservation, so including historic district commissions, there are definitely exceptions, but on average, and historical and advocacy organizations and societies, they're also almost all white. If you look at the National Register of Historic Places, the official document that says that these places are historic, only 5% of those nominations represent something to do with non-white history. And the last really big one that relates to gentrification is that almost all of the financial incentives for historic preservation, they benefit white communities entirely. There's lots of nuances that I can certainly go into in this, but we're now having frank discussions in the preservation field about essentially white supremacy in the field. And it relates to really the systemic advocacy, I guess, around the idea of what I've been hearing people now beginning to call white taste. That's not what preservation needs to be, and it's not certainly how we're going to work with LGBTQ communities or any marginalized communities. And so I love to talk to people about recognizing this and addressing it. So
well said. I am impressed. I don't know about you guys, but I am learning. I'm engaged, and I want to open the floor up to everyone who is out there, who's listening to us. If you have a burning question, now would be the time to post your question, to post your thoughts about what has been said so far. I do want to tell you that there are a few Pride events that are coming up in Montgomery County while people are getting their questions together. I think we have I want to also just let you know we have about 10 minutes left, and Commissioner Varma, I want to get you to elaborate, because there's this thing called white supremacy, and defining that. Do you mind taking a stab at that? I'm sorry to just toss it in your lap.
Sure, and I'll let some of the other academics chime in as well. But I just wanted to make it clear, the way Jeremy was using the term white supremacy is talking more about institutionally how certain factions of our government processes have disproportionately benefited white people, or in some cases, people of a certain socioeconomic status, which for the longest time was white people and continues to be white people. And so I don't want to, sometimes people can conflate between white supremacy and white supremacists. The two are sometimes, interchangeable in some ways. But I just wanted to make that clarification. And Jeremy, please expand. I'm sure I didn't, cover everything there.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that in academia, the idea of white supremacy is that we use these big phrases, ontology and epistemology, basically how we view what's real in the world and what's not, and what we consider to be valid knowledge and what's not. White people get to define that. That's really the core of what white supremacy is in higher education and how we're teaching. We're recognizing that that's a core part of historic preservation, and we need to stop it.
And we have one last comment from Free. You're going to be the last one until we get some other questions here. So Free.
Oh, I just simply wanted to add, if we put it in, let's pretend it's a building, we have a solid foundation with, let's just say, white bricks that have been built upon generation after generation after generation. And then when other people were allowed to bring forth their bricks, they were adding their bricks onto an already existing structure. So, and if that helps people to understand better what the idea of, sort of whiteness and how it fits, that is how I try to explain it. So I hope that helps.
It does. And we have a question here from our assistant planning director, Tanya Stern. She says, I've done some engagement on planning projects in areas that experience a lot of change, and sometimes would hear from a community member about what used to be. They pointed out locations and history that would not be obvious. How can planners share what you hear so that we can preserve these stories or this history of place? I think I'm going to give it to Jeremy, because I know that you've spent a ton of time in Baltimore doing, and I also wanted to just touch on this concept of the intersectionality of art and preservation as an expression. So where the tangible, the things that the physical forms meets the intangible. If you could touch and elaborate on this question, Jeremy.
Yeah. So if I understand where the person asking this question is coming from, so in planning practice, we hear all sorts of things from members of different communities about what's important or not important, certainly in their built environment or related to their history and identity. And the way I'm interpreting this question is, how do we take sort of the anecdotal information that's being shared with us and turn it into something that's useful for change? So that's the way I'm interpreting the question. So the way I would answer that is to provide the public more opportunities for these discussions, so that they don't predominantly embody these, off chance discussions with a planner, that they're more part of the planning practice. And so what we're talking about is a more of a grassroots planning process that, those of us working in planning, we're familiar with Arnstein's ladder of participation. We need to move up that ladder. We need to be able to empower members of different communities to be more central to how we decide what's important in planning. So we're not talking at people, we're talking with people, and as much as we can, putting them as sort of knowledge peers with us, and respecting what I would call situated or contextual knowledge. So it's just basically making them more systemic within planning practice would be my short answer.
That's great. That's awesome. And I want to say thank you to our great panel. Just when the conversation starts to get good and we got to stop, I do want to I want to bring your attention and awareness. Hopefully I got to every single question. Thanks again for those who were able to tune in to us. In Montgomery County, we have a few Pride events coming up on June 19th. We have Broadway and Disney sing-along, and I think it's important because right now each one of us needs a good old-fashioned laugh and just to have a lot of good fun. I hope that you are taking time to enjoy and have some good fun in your life and some good laughter, because we need it. Boy, do we need it ever now. On the 24th, there's contemporary conversations starting at 7 p.m. On the 26th, there's also a youth poetry slam that starts at 6 p.m. And this is all programs that are going to be run through the executive, the county council, the county executive's office and the county council's office. They're running Pride events. So if you are able to attend those, I highly encourage that you do that. I want to give special thanks to everyone, the panel, Gwen Wright, Samantha, Brian, Jesse, all of you for helping to put this together. Tamika, the Equity Working Group. If I'm forgetting someone, please forgive me. If I didn't get a chance to answer your question, please email me your question and I will solicit that or send it out to the panel itself. My email again is Madeline, MOLLINE.Jackson@montgomeryplanning.org. It's also in the chat, but I will put it there. Do we have anything else? I'm looking through the questions. Oh, wait, we have a few more questions. If we have just a few more minutes, there's something from Jacqueline. To piggyback off of Jeremy's comment about the historic preservation being a white field, there are plans and organizations that provide lectures, classes, tours, etc., classrooms. Are there, that's the question, are there plans or organizations that help to instill excitement and interest in the field? And I think this question is for, let's go with Jeremy. If you, oh, and Megan, do you have something that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, sure, I can add a couple thoughts to it. I think Jeremy's done great research in what the field of preservation looks like, and I think it sounded worse than even I knew how the lack of diversity affects it, but he's great at digging into those numbers. There are a couple of, I would say most preservation organizations and cultural resource management firms are at least getting to the point where they are actively thinking about trying to be more diverse, and I think there's a lot a long way for us to go. I know the National Trust has a wonderful African American grant fund program, and obviously the stuff that Free was doing there. I also know at the federal level, the Advisory Council is working on a, I want to say trades training, because there are, even within preservation, there are thinkers, there are doers, and I think diversifying both the academic and the professional side, as well as the trade side, where there is a National Park Service backlog and open jobs and an opportunity to make both preservation and the active preservation a little bit more colorful. I think those opportunities exist, and I don't have great examples because I think they're in the works, but perhaps Jeremy does, or Free.
Well, I'm not aware of, well, let me say this way, within the LGBTQ community, there are definitely some people that are really standing out, like Megan Springgate, for instance, and I give lots of credit to Meg as being a leader in this as well, that are forming centers right now around advocacy in this area. The more formalized versions I can give you as an example, around the Latinx community, there's a group called the Latinos in Heritage Conservation that's been very proactive on all these things we're talking about, of decentered whiteness and preservation. And that's sort of, I think, one of the better examples in terms of organization. In the African American community, there are definitely groups organized around history and promoting it. I've not seen a group yet arise. You know, I certainly can be missing something, but that specifically is intersecting with historic preservation practice in the way that Latinos in historic preservation or heritage conservation does. I know I'm missing a few others, but we need more of them. And I would say the National Trust is the most organized around here. And I think Meg has something to contribute.
Yes, I will have to Google this, or the folks on the call can. I do believe architecture is experiencing the same problem, and I know that there's national and chapters for, I think it's called the National Organization for Minority Architects, NOMA, and I believe that they have a national group and chapters. So to where preservation and planners can look to architecture or all those allied fields, there might be examples to have those fields come together and approach problems that they're all experiencing and that need to be addressed. And I think Free had a comment too.
Yeah, I just wanted to let, so NOMA, yes, the National Organization of Minority Architects is an organization. I'll just go back to my old hat when I was at the National Trust. Yes, there are precious few minorities in the broader historic preservation community. We usually try to do a get together at the National Preservation Conferences when we were there. One of the ways where you could see some efforts at expansion was through the Diversity Scholarship Program by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which I used to run when I was Director for Diversity. And it was amazing being able to identify people from across the country who could be brought into the preservation world, because usually they weren't, trained preservationists doing that sort of work. The other thing that is unfortunate is that Delaware State University used to have a preservation program, and it was the only HBCU that had a graduate level preservation program. And I want to say that Morgan State University there in Maryland is either attempting one or they're teaching their students historic preservation courses. Perhaps, I'm not really sure. But the bottom line is that it's going to take an effort to bring people into a field that some would argue, going back to the idea that it's a privilege to work in historic preservation. It was a privilege for me as a third generation Black college man to go into academic history and then to historic preservation when other people are looking at becoming doctors, lawyers, engineers, or teachers. So the idea is that you're going to have to really it's going to be an effort to find folks. And usually what you'll find is that those who are working specifically on historic places that are in danger are going to be your first choices, your best people to identify, who can get into this field. And then once people get into it, hire them. Just hire them as an independent consultant. I'm just saying, people of color can do more than just the preservation work that is focused on the identity with which they correspond. They can do Section 106 reviews if they're trained in that. They can do historic interpretations for minority related history related sites. Treat people like the training that they have. That's all those folks are asking for, people like me are asking for. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Free. And we are over time, but this conversation was so worthy. We are at 1:37. I'm just going to let you do some closing remarks. Please keep it brief if you can. And we're going to start with Megan.
Great. I want to take my time to just say thank you to all the panelists and the organizers in Montgomery County for approaching Thrive 2050, with this. I think the power of preservation, even though it's focused in history, obviously we've already brought together these threads of relevancy that we're all going through today, and I just think the power of including this history for everyone in the LGBTQ community and allies will just it will, once we plant these seeds, it will grow, and I really think that just this one community and how we're approaching it will hopefully change how we do preservation and how we do public history to benefit people's lives now. And I think that that's a powerful thing that Montgomery County is bringing to the forefront by doing this as part of an active planning process. So thank you.
And Free.
I simply wanted to say thank you all for thinking of including me, a good old Virginian and a former DC resident, in this discussion. And I was happy to do it. I'm always excited to speak on issues related to historic preservation, to speak on issues related to diversity within the historic preservation movement or the preservation enterprise. I'll have to begin to incorporate that into my discussion as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And again, if you run across any non-white preservation professionals, hire them. Just saying, hire them. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jeremy?
Well, first thing is, I just wanted to thank everyone for helping to organize this. These kinds of conversations are just absolutely fantastic and mainstreams these kinds of conversations. And just I'd like to leave everybody with a thought that what we're doing today shouldn't be the exception, it should be the rule, and how we do that. And along those lines, I did forget to mention one very important new organization for Asian and Pacific Islanders in preservation. They call themselves the Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. And it's been headed by one of my colleagues, Michelle Magalong at the University of Maryland. And so we have two, Latinos and Heritage Conservation and the organization I just mentioned. So prototypes that other people can emulate.
And with that being said, we have two more events that I want to mention, but I'm closing it off and letting you know that Commissioner Varma had to leave and go to another meeting, but I'm sure that he would say he enjoyed himself and that he appreciated being here as well. We have an event, another conversation. So this was number three, everyone. This will be number 3 coming up on Friday, June 26th, and we will be focusing on seniors and youth. But before we get to the 26th, we also have a Pride Month event on Monday, the 22nd, which I'm not sure is open to the public. I think it is, but email me if you're interested in participating in it. But it's coming up on Monday, June 22nd, and it's partner for LGBT and inclusion. This event will start around lunchtime from 12 to 2 p.m. Again, our conversation on the 26th will be around the same time frame from 12 to about 2 as well. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at some of the Pride events. Have a good day. Bye.